Hear all the latest news and have your say. This is Montreal Now with Aaron Rand on CJAD 800.
All right, listen, I want to bring this up. Blue Monday, it's a tough time for many, many people, obviously, although some say, it's just another day on the calendar, but it is officially today, Blue Monday. So I found it interesting, came across this article that I thought might be worth kind of addressing, especially on a day like today. It talks about the fact that many of us chase happiness, but this chase can lead us to feel dissatisfied with life, like, there should be something more. Our next guest, Stephen Bruyant-Langer, is an executive coach and leadership expert. He's also the author of a book called The Existential Playbook, How to Survive, Live, and Thrive, which looks at why so many people feel dissatisfied with life, and offering some advice on how to overcome it. He is on the line. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Aaron.
I should mention, we're reaching you in Denmark. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Denmark, yes.
Welcome. So let's talk about, I mentioned today is Blue Monday, and for a lot of people, it's a rather depressing day, whether it's about the fact that, your New Year's resolutions did not happen and won't yet again. You address some real issues here, and I find it fascinating because when you talk about something as general or as vague as chasing happiness, we all want to be happy. So why is this a concern?
Well, first of all, there's some models that you can put up, and I did so in my book, The Existential Playbook. I've been working for, 30 years now as an executive coach, working with high achievers, people who want to make something out of their life. And in this context, I've come across a lot of existentialist thinking, thinking about getting meaning into your life. And there's one existentialist philosopher who's especially interesting in this context. And Aaron, please stop me if this becomes a sort of a lecturer, because I'm fascinated by the theory, but we need to get some practice into it also, right?
No, please, so go ahead.
Okay, so Hannah Arendt, H-A-N-N-A-H, and then Arendt is a German philosopher, but moved to the U.S. and was a U.S. national. And she has worked with three concepts called labor, work, and action. And these concepts actually totally align with what I've had in my book, the Survive, Live, and Thrive. So what she calls labor, I call survival. What she calls work, I call live or life. And what she calls action, I call thrive. And it probably means a bit necessary to explain a bit more. We all know it in our daily life. If it becomes too intellectual, too much thinking, then we need to do something practical. And for example, mowing the lawn, right? So if we mow the lawn, it's repetitive. It's nice because you don't have to think that much, and you have to do it again. But it's what we call the body work, right? And that corresponds to survival. However, at some point we also need to create things. We need to do things with our hands and enjoying both the process and the product. And that is what I call living, and she calls work. And then we have also to think about things and to give back and to participate in the community and the world. And the essence of all this, chasing happiness, as you started by asking, the essence is to have a balance in this. And it doesn't mean that you have to have 1/3 of body work and 1/3 of hand work or 1/3 of soul work or mind work, but you need to have a balance. And Aaron, you probably feel it also from time to time, when you've been too busy, too much thinking, too much talking, then, you need to do something different. I just came back from a run in the woods, and the fact of running is also simply body work. You don't need to think that much. You sort of get out of your usual sphere. Mm-hmm. So it's the alternatives, and that is what I would call one of the secrets of living a good life, as the Greeks said, or thriving in general, and that is happiness. If you get a balance in your life.
It's interesting as I hear you say this, and I'm sure for some people, they've probably heard these kinds of things before about that balance. It's a word that's become very popular these days. Yes. You also mentioned, though, it's important to recognize a balance or an imbalance, right? It's not just enough to say, I know I should do these particular things because they're good for me. You have to recognize that you're not doing them.
Exactly. And you need also to be able to decipher the signals that you have. It could be impatience or frustration or nervousness or also stress. It could be different, let's say, signals that come to you, and you need to be able to find out, what is out of balance and what can I do. For example, mentioning again from a practical point of view, the having a run in the woods or going out would break a sort of feeling of isolation or being only in your head. It's important that you find your personal ways of getting out of a state which you might describe as unhappy or frustrated.
All right. So given that, and now here you are at the beginning of the year, I brought up sort of, New Year's resolutions that one makes, which typically might involve some of these different things to recognize that you're not doing, that you want to do more of. I would think as well, I mentioned, it's Blue Monday, so people 3 weeks into the year may have now said, well, I tried again, it's not going to work. How do you get back on track?
Well, you simply focus and you prioritize. There's no other way than focusing on the task at hand. It takes a lot of time to do something that you're not working on. So you simply need to have it top of mind and also not hitting yourself on the head. If it's not working and if you are not able to find the motivation to change your habit, then it might not be important enough for you. And again, it's totally up to you, Aaron. It's not up to other people to judge. It's your own personal decisions, and you need to take, to make a choice and to take action and take responsibility for that.
Yeah, taking responsibility is a big one, isn't it? All right. The book is called, for people who do want to check it out, The Existential Playbook, How to Survive, Live, and Thrive. The author, Stephen Bruyant-Langer, who we've been speaking to now. Thank you so much for your time today, and enjoy your run in the woods.
The very latest news, reported and discussed. Welcome back to Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
All right, time for us to check in with Dr. Joe Schwarz, who joins us on Tuesday afternoons. He, of course, is host of the Dr. Joe Show, which airs Sundays at 3 here on CJAD, and director of the McGill Office for Science and Society. So, Joe, I like the headline today, which is simply this: is your watchband poisoning you? Please explain.
Well, there's a study that came out from Notre Dame University from reputable scientists, and what they did was they took watch bands like the ones that are on the Apple Watch. These are made of what are known as fluoroelastomers. And
let me stop you. We're not talking the watch itself. We're talking specifically the band?
The band.
Okay.
The band, yeah. Now, the reason that those are made of these fluoropolymers is because it makes them last long. People, of course, tend to wear these a lot when they're exercising. So there's rubbing and, contact with sweat and whatever.
Right.
And so these are, very sturdy watch bands. So they're made of fluoroelastomers, and so they contain compounds with fluorine atoms. And these are the ones that have been subject of much debate over the years, a class known as perfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, because even in very small amounts, they have been found in animals to cause various reactions. And there's concern that because of the buildup in the environment, they're referred to as forever chemicals because they don't biodegrade, that eventually they end up in our body and can cause problems. It's a legitimate concern because we know that these chemicals are in our water, they're in our food, they're everywhere because they have been now produced for decades and they don't degrade, so they do end up in the environment. The question is whether or not these are significant amounts. Do they cause any harm? So there are studies that examine our exposure from all kinds of things. And it was not unreasonable to try to see whether or not when you wear these bands and, you sweat, does it lead to absorption of these perfluoro compounds into your bloodstream. So here's a study that they actually did. They took a sample of these. They studied about 20 of these bands taken from different watches. Mm. They cut them up into tiny pieces, and they immersed them in a solvent to see how much of these fluorinated compounds would be extracted into the solvent, which is, this is technically doable. This is a common way of measuring, doing extractions. And so they found that indeed there were these compounds that showed up in the solvent, and therefore they surmised that some of these will get into the bloodstream from the watch strap, because the watch strap is in contact with sweat. Some of these compounds could dissolve in the sweat and therefore get into the bloodstream. So it's a reasonable, experiment. Now, as you probably know, I'm a stickler for numbers, because science revolves around numbers. I mean, that's the alphabet of science. We're always measuring things. We're comparing things to known standards. So I took a look at the numbers here, given the number of alarming headlines that cropped up in the last couple of days, on my feed about alarming numbers, alarming PFAS extracted from watch bands and headlines like that. So I took a look at the numbers and the median amount that was extracted in all of these studies. And I said to myself, all right, what would happen if someone were to eat one of these watch straps over the period of a year? That is, you ate a little bit of it every day, so that over a year you consumed the whole watch strap. What would that mean in terms of potential toxicity? Well, I did some calculations, and so if let's say a 70-kilogram adult, I figured how much of this would get into your body. And I took a look at the most stringent threshold, which is the European threshold, which is 4.4 milligrams per kilogram. That's the amount that they think causes absolutely no problem. Well, it turned out that the amount, if you ate this watch strap over a period of a year, would turn out to be about 1/4 every day of the maximum daily intake. So I don't think this is a significant issue, because obviously by saying that you eat this watch strap over a period of a year, you're greatly exaggerating the amount that can get into your body. Because obviously, if you wear this watch strap, it is not going to disappear within a year, right? It's not going to wear into your body within a year. I mean, the fact is that, I have an Apple Watch, and I think I've worn it now for 4 years, and the strap looks exactly the way it looked before. It has not disintegrated, so, the amount that would have gone into the bloodstream, I think, would be trivial. So I don't say that it's an experiment that shouldn't have been done, because it's interesting. It adds to our body of knowledge. But I think the inference that was made by the media, saying that alarming amounts of PFAS are absorbed into the body from these watch straps, I think that it's not true that it's alarming by the simple sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations that I made, but I think it's a reasonable calculation.
Sometimes I think, Joe, you have too much free time, to be thinking about eating watch bands. So, but that's fine. I'm glad you did this, so no reason to worry at the end of the day. I want to get to this next story, because you and I have talked about this many times, the idea of processed foods. We should all know now, and obviously the more processed they are, the worse they are for you. Now there's a lawsuit. What's this about?
Yeah, now this is a more significant issue. There's a young kid, I think 16 years old, named Bryce Martinez in Philadelphia, who has launched a lawsuit against a number of companies that include Coca-Cola, Pepsi, General Mills, Nestle, Kellogg, Mars. So these are, major companies. And the allegation is that, let me give you the exact wording here. The complaint argues that ultra-processed foods are designed to be addictive, using techniques borrowed from the tobacco industry to manipulate consumer behavior and brain chemistry. This includes the use of specific additives and processing methods that enhance palatability and drive consumption far beyond what is healthy or unnecessary. So this lawsuit is very similar to what was launched against the tobacco industry. We'll see where this goes. I mean, it's going to be fascinating legalistics. I mean, I don't think that the companies are going to debate that they try to make their food palatable. I mean, that's what you do when you try to sell a product, right? When you're trying to sell a food, of course you're trying to make it palatable. So the question is that, should these foods come with a warning like you get on cigarette labels? Because the evidence isn't clear cut about what these processed foods do. I think we have a lot of suggestive evidence that these are not the best kind of foods to eat. But to prove in a court of law that the companies have conspired to addict people to certain foods, I think that's going to be very challenging to prove. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this pans out. And as you can imagine, I mean, these companies are probably horrified that this could be the first of many such lawsuits. And of course, the law firm that did this is already advertising for others to join the lawsuit. Well, so it's interesting.
I guess we're all about to find out just how bad bacon actually is for us, right? So, okay.
Right.
And everything else. Joe, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Take good care. Aaron. Dr. Joe Schwarz.
Because you don't want to miss a thing. Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
So Dr. Chris Labos, who joins us from time to time here on the show, every time there's a health story, I think to reach out because you keep seeing these kinds of stories. Dr. Labos, by the way, is a cardiologist with a degree in epidemiology. You can also catch him, by the way, Sundays here with Joanne Vrakas at 7:20 a.m. So, Chris, I sent you this because I saw this the other day, and I thought, well, we've talked about Ozempic before, so why is this any different now? And then from what I gather, this new study that shows that drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy, right, we know about what they can do to help with weight loss, but then they're suggesting in these studies they actually, we think they suggest, they can lower the risk of things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So pretty significant. Let's address that first.
Right. So here's the thing. I mean, obviously these medications were initially designed to be diabetes drugs. And then sort of almost accidentally, although not really accidentally, it was discovered that they could be helpful for losing weight, which is why they become so popular. But they have a number of downstream consequences / benefits as well. The one that has been most seriously studied, because there were dedicated trials to that effect, were in terms of cardiovascular disease, right? There were specific trials designed to look at whether these drugs can prevent heart attacks, and that's why there's been this real sort of push to get them approved and covered, because these are disease prevention drugs. But there's a whole lot of things that are sort of tangentially related to all of this, diseases that are consequences of diabetes that very, very likely are going to show benefits as well, even though we haven't done dedicated trials to establish them. So the big one that you mentioned is dementia. People forget that diabetes is one of the many risk factors that can increase the risk of dementia, both Alzheimer's disease specifically and dementia in general. And so any medication that is going to treat diabetes, help with weight loss, reduce your cardiovascular risk factors is also going to help with dementia and a lot of the other vascular diseases that we have across our body. So these medications are not just about style. They're not just about weight loss. They are about disease prevention. And what this paper was doing was actually categorizing where a lot of the potential benefit might be and trying to do a sort of evidence synthesis of where we are now, with the understanding that some of these things are more well established than others, but there's a lot of interest, not just for dementia, but also things for like obsessive compulsive disorder and a lot of sort of these psychological things that you might say, wait, what does this have to do with the diabetes drugs? But these drugs also affect the brain, also affect the hunger response, and there's a lot of overlap between those brain reactions that trigger satiety, the feeling of fullness, and a lot of the stuff that we see in terms of, addiction, compulsive gambling, stuff like that.
Okay, so that's a pretty wide-ranging, potential benefit profile for something like one of these particular, drugs or medications. But then, of course, and we talked about this before too, there's, the downside, and there's some of those brought up in here as well. There's some possible, things that could happen if you're on these medications.
Yeah, they are, and all medications have side effects, and you have to know that going in. The big side effect is going to be the gastrointestinal side effects, so the nausea, the upset stomach, which for a lot of people means they can't tolerate the medication. And so there is a way to minimize that. You have to start at a low dose and increase it slowly over the course of many, many weeks. But it is going to be a problem for people. And there have been instances where the gastrointestinal effects have been so bad where you even get something akin to like a stomach paralysis, where the stomach is not emptying, which in some respects is a good thing because it means you won't eat as much and you'll lose weight. But it can be taken to an extreme where you basically can't eat anything anymore and people get very, very sick. And then you end up not even absorbing some of your medication. So there was a term that was flying around the internet for a while called the Mounjaro baby. So Mounjaro is not Ozempic. It's the other medication that works by a similar mechanism of action. And there were case reports of women who were taking their birth control pills, which were not getting absorbed because they were staying in their stomach and were getting pregnant accidentally because the medication was essentially preventing their birth control from being absorbed. So if you think about it, that, I mean, we can talk about whether getting pregnant is considered a drug side effect or not, but you can imagine that it can have some rather significant implications to your life. So they are not benign medications, but they have the potential to have a lot of benefits. You just have to realize that there are side effects associated with them as well.
We get back to this issue of, okay, we've heard these drugs and we have people swearing by them. If you're on social media at all, all the influencers that are out there. To the state, we talked about this as well before, to the part where the government should be covering these kinds of things because these drugs work and they are helping people. Have we moved any further on that?
Well, no, the government is not going to cover them. The one thing I would like to point out to people who sort of push back on this, the government does cover bariatric surgery, though, right? They will pay for you to have bariatric surgery because they understand that if you use it in the correct patient population, bariatric surgery does prevent health problems later down the line. So it is a little bit, to me, unjustifiable that you can say, well, we're going to cover bariatric surgery because obesity is a chronic disease, but we're not going to cover these medications because, and I think the calculus that's going into their heads is that they can control the number of bariatric surgeries by limiting OR time, whereas these medications, I think they know once they open the floodgates, they will be used and it will be very expensive. And it will be cost effective in the long term, but in the short term, I think they're looking at that price tag and realizing we just may not have the money to pay for this.
Do you have cause as a doctor to be concerned with how many people are just going ahead willy-nilly and using this? You can get a prescription from this. You can go online and get one as well. Are you concerned?
I am concerned because there's a big problem going on, more so in the States, but also here, of people going to compound pharmacies and getting these medications manufactured, not by the manufacturer. And you might say, oh, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is there have been reports of people going out and buying what they thought was Ozempic that ended up being insulin and then going into like hypoglycemia, which can cause you to lapse into a coma. So there is a big problem with counterfeit medications out there. And the more you restrict this, the more people go searching for cheaper alternatives, the more you leave them open to exploitation. And there's been a real problem with sort of fake drugs on the market. So, yeah, I am a little bit worried.
Okay. Dr. Labos, I appreciate it.
The very latest news, reported and discussed. Welcome back to Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
It is time to check in with CJAD's legal analyst, that is Chris Dimakos. And Chris, we're going to talk today about a story that's very much in the news, and that's a situation that we think all found out about this morning, apparently including people who worked for Amazon. And that is the fact that Amazon's going to be basically shutting down in Quebec. So this is going to affect, we understand, about at least 1,700 workers. Question is, can you just go ahead and do that? What happens to the people working there? Unions, what's next here?
Yeah, so just to give some context, what happened was there was an application to certify a union within the Laval warehouse of Amazon, and they got certified. And the next step was by January, right now, they're supposed to come to an agreement. So the employer, Amazon, and the union, and the people representing the union were supposed to come to some sort of contractual agreement, the collective bargaining agreement, that would basically be the governing rule between both parties. And Amazon answers by saying, we're shutting the whole thing down in Quebec. Now, they've come out and said publicly with their lawyers that it's not in response to what happened with the union certification, but it's the only province where this is happening, and it's right in line with when they had to come to some sort of agreement before the companies would strike. So it's almost as if not only is this an answer to the Quebec attempt to certify, but I think what Amazon's doing here is they're trying to send a message not only to the rest of the provinces in Canada, that if you try to go this way, we're not going to do business in your province. So it's unfortunate. Many people have lost their jobs because of this, but there are more and more, there's a debate now as to whether or not unions are being able to achieve what they used to be able to do 50 years ago. It's a little bit different. Landscape of employment's different. Job conditions, it's not so much people are afraid for their safety anymore. It's developed a lot since then. There's been a lot of laws that protect employees. So the actual, the raison d'etre of unions has come into question more often than not. And this is another example of people starting to question whether or not they want a union where they work.
So, the Amazon union issue, I trying to remember going back a few years, I think this first happened at a plant in the U.S., in northern New York or somewhere, which became the first, I think, to decide to do this. Do you know, how have these things gone along the way? Because you mentioned Quebec is kind of setting the example for the rest of Canada here. There are other unionized shops, though, in Amazon.
There are. I think what's happening, especially with the Quebec, it's a huge, in terms of the market. We're talking about 1,900 jobs, so it's significant. There's no question about it. And I also think the climate here in Quebec, when you look at not only it's in questions of salary increases, but there's a lot of additional requirements for employers, especially those that come from outside of Quebec, that they have to comply with in Quebec. And sometimes when you start adding and compiling all these different obligations, so-called red tape, sometimes the company says, you know what, maybe it wasn't the best decision to go in there, and they're doing what they do here. Now, I'm not saying that what Amazon is doing is right, but there's no question that Quebec, being the one that's suffering these 1,900 job loss, you have to look at the whole situation in Quebec and why it happened here and not, for example, somewhere else.
Okay, so I hate to kind of phrase it this way. Are we looking here, because you mentioned, I think it's important for people to remember, union certification here was granted. So As you just said, the idea being, okay, yes, you could form a union. Now we sit and negotiate. It seems almost like Amazon had planned this all along.
Right, and I think that the lawyers, when that happened, they had a meeting. They took a decision as to what they're going to do. But other companies like Walmart, this has happened before in Quebec. But what has happened is a store has closed down, and then the union doesn't go away. You can have that union if the jobs are being transferred to another store. Well, then the union would get transferred to another store. And what Amazon did here was they basically said, we're going to wipe out all of the warehouses in Quebec. And what that does is basically they even offered a package to employees to basically tell them, hey, we're giving you this on top of us shutting down your doors, so to dissuade them from trying to keep this from going on. But I think the message for everyone here is, the way the law is set up, and this is what I'm concerned with. The way it's set up, it was set up in a way that was effective 50 years ago. The way they get certified and the obligations of how employers have to deal with employees. And I think if we want to have unions as part of the equation going forward, we have to look at how these unions are formed and how much power they have and what they can and cannot negotiate, because it's not the first and it won't be the last time that a big company like Amazon is going to decide to leave Quebec just because of that.
I guess the only other question I have is with respect to, and we know the Premier speaking on this today, he's going to have to address this. Is there anything a government can do or not?
They can. They can do it, but you can never force a company, a privately owned company, to do business in your province. Right. You can offer incentives, but what happens is when government imposes additional requirements, like the so-called red tape, whether it be language, whether it be taxes, whether it be all the different requirements when you hire and when you interview, when it crosses that threshold of what the company is willing to do and willing not to do. Just a quick reference: I have a client who came to see me who wanted to invest in a franchise. one of the fastest growing franchises in the U.S. and in Canada. And we spoke to the legal team at that franchise, and they said we don't want to go into Quebec. We're not prepared now to change all of our signage, all of our language, all of our contracts.
Right.
They just weren't ready. They said we might do it in the future, but it's not on the cards right now. So there's a lot that goes into a company coming into Quebec, a lot of additional costs that they might not have to go through in other jurisdictions.
Sure, but in the case of Amazon, I mean, specifically, they didn't just get here. They've been here for several years, so they went through this at the outset. I can't imagine that would have had anything to do with them leaving, or maybe it did. I mean, we don't know.
Well, I don't think that was the reason why they left. I do think, though, that the coincidence is just too far-fetched. I think that the fact that they shut this down when they were supposed to come to an agreement in January, after they spent a lot of money on buildings and infrastructure and training. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars that they invested in Quebec, only to shut it down. For me, it's a direct correlation to the fact that they believe if the unions start developing and flourishing in Quebec, it's going to mean that they're going to lose a lot of their profit margins, and they just don't want to go there.
Okay. Last question. With respect to those people, the 1,700 full-time and a couple of hundred part-time who are losing their jobs, what can they do in terms of collecting some kind of benefits? Unemployment insurance is at the end of it?
Right. So they are entitled to employment insurance because they've lost their jobs through no fault of their own. They also are offered a package, I believe, from what I read to the lawyer statements, that Amazon's offering incentives. But once those incentives get used up, they can fall onto employment insurance after that.
Okay. So you can't really, as someone who lost their job, if you choose not to accept whatever's being offered to you, I guess it doesn't make sense or much sense to go ahead and fight it and try to take it to court.
You could. You'd have to look at where the chips are going to fall following. So what presence will Amazon have in Quebec? They talked about using third party,
right?
But you want to look at what presence they do have in Quebec and determine whether or not it's worth it to seek. If you refuse that package, what can you go and get afterwards?
Okay, so. Chris, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron.
Because you don't want to miss a thing. Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
It is Bell Let's Talk Day. I'm sure if you had the radio on today, listen to CJD, you already know that. We've talked to a variety of people through the course of the day and going to do it again now because today the focus is on youth mental health. And I will mention again, don't forget, Bell is matching your $5 donations up to $1 million today. If you text the word youth, YOUTH, to 45678, make a $5 donation. As I said, Bell will match up to $1 million. You know, it's one thing to talk about it, and it's another to get a personal story about someone who has lived through something like this, the mental health issue within a family or a friend, and that's what our next guest has had happen. Paul Hollingsworth is a CTV National News correspondent in Halifax. He is on the line. Paul, thank you. I know sometimes these stories are hard to share, but now it's important that they be shared as well.
No, well, for sure. Thank you for having me on the show. And after 34 years, I don't say this to be callous. I'm pretty nimble talking about it. Driving through the neighborhoods in Halifax where we grew up, sometimes wounds will open up. But on a day like today, it's a good conversation to have, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to have it with you.
And we are grateful that you were taking the time to have that conversation, because this Bell Let's Talk Day is all about that. It's about having that conversation, starting that conversation, which is so difficult sometimes for so many. So in your particular case, let's go back. You're in university. It's 1991. And you received some devastating news about your brother. So pick it up from there.
Yeah, no, listen, and just to back it up a chapter before that, we had a very normal childhood. He was 3 years older than me. We loved baseball. We were both huge Montreal Expos fans. We'd go to Montreal for numerous summer vacations to watch our favorite baseball team. We were big Montreal Canadiens fans. We shared a love of sports. We had friendship groups in common. We lived in a bedroom with bunk beds. I was in the bottom. He was on the top. And we had, by all accounts, a normal older brother, younger brother childhood. I saw in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, things started to change a little bit. You pick up behavioral patterns, changes. He was withdrawing from his friendship group. And then he started to get heavily into drugs and alcohol. And, on the one hand, I knew something was wrong. On the other hand, I was just a kid. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the tools in my toolbox. We didn't talk about things. And I certainly didn't even process the notion of it having a tragic outcome. So I just pretended everything would fix itself and he'd be okay. And the week leading into Christmas in 1991, it was not okay. He took his own life. I had to go to the morgue to identify him. I had to tell my parents, my siblings, my grandparents. And it was very painful. I mean, we can get into what I think are real positive outcomes in my life from that day, but I can tell you to have that in my family and to throw that around the context of talking about youth today, whatever you think the pain of that moment was, multiply it by 1,000. It was truly horrible. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but I am proud to tell you that you don't come away from an event like that, but you go through an event like that. And if you come on the other side and you empty your heart of grievance and anger and you pursue more productive community-minded outcomes, you can draw some positives from what was truly an appalling tragedy for our family.
If we can travel back in time, so you describe a perfectly normal childhood, an idyllic kind of childhood, as you describe it, very close with your brother. When you began to notice the change, would you now, which is, of course, the benefit of hindsight, have wished you could have talked about it with him sooner?
Without question. And it's your question's the best question to ask. It's the most probative question to ask. And it's the question that I have such an unsatisfactory answer, because back then I just decided not to do enough.
Yeah.
I didn't come from a culture. My parents were great people. They've both passed now. But I grew up in a family where they were very strict. You know, children were to be seen and not heard, and not in a mean way, but there wasn't that level of engagement. The way I would compare it to how my wife and I bring up our two kids. So I was conditioned to not say anything, to not identify it. I mean, if I can't prove this, but if I went to my parents in 1989 and I said, hey, Mom and Dad, I think Bryce might have mental illness. What can we do about that? They probably would have judged me in a negative way for bringing up such a terrible topic that would have to be not true based on their initial judgment, because we just didn't talk about it. There was a stigma. We pushed it aside. You know, I say, you know, tongue in cheek, if I had a time machine, I'd go back in time and save him. It's impossible to do it. I sure wish they'd invent one so I could do it. But the truth is, you know, if I knew then what I know now, the work I could have done to help him. But it informs my attitude today when it comes to the work I can do and do in the community. I'm just one person. I'm not a behavioral expert. I'm not a professional advocate. But I do live in a community. I do share space with people, and I try to identify opportunities every single day to talk to people, to support the people, to be kind, to always encourage, to never discourage, and let them know that they are not alone.
Yeah. You know, it's wonderful that you're doing that in your community. And obviously on a day like today, it's important to know that you, just as an individual, can do something. It doesn't have to revolve around an entire community. It can revolve just from between two people. And I wonder if it's enough sometimes, and you'd be in a much better position given that you do this now, Paul, if it's just okay when you begin to notice that things are different, that things are beginning to change, and simply ask the question, are you okay?
Without question. Speak up. If you think someone needs help, Aaron, offer them help. If they refuse help, because let's face it, sometimes the people we love the most, who are closest to us, are the ones that, oddly enough, refuse our assistance. Ask again. But take it one step further with your friendships, with your relationships, with your micro relationships. Treat your relationships and the quality of your relationships as a personal code of conduct, as I try to do. And I'm not saying that in a preachy way, but I've actually forced myself. I've tried to rewire my brain when it comes to this, because I'm in the community every day looking for that Bryce Hollingsworth. Who's the young person in peril, who's suffering in silence, that no one in the room is noticing? Who's the lonely person in a room full of people off to the side that nobody's noticing? Because of what happened in my life, whatever it did, it sparked some sort of sensitive gene in me that I try to identify these things. And you reach out to people. I will tell you, I had a woman call our TV station a while back, and she said her son was 17 or 18 years old. He was suffering from anxiety. He liked watching me on TV. Could I come to the house to visit him? Because his anxiety was so bad, he hadn't left the house in 2 years. Wow. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I don't know if I helped him or not, but I jumped in the car and I went to see him. It was a gift to have that. But I shouldn't have people calling me to offer that. I think if we look closely in our communities, we can see opportunities every day to intervene in a very kind, supportive way. And, you know, look at, I mentioned baseball a second ago. You get 3 hits out of 10, you're batting 300. Sure. Well, what if I reached out to 100 people every year in a real meaningful way, and I connected with, 30 of them? I'll take that as a starting point. And maybe next year it's 35, and maybe next year it's 40. And that's why a day like today is so important. I will add, I live my life with these details every day of the year. But on a day like today, I just think it's so important to put the message across, because there are young people, as you said off the top, there are young people in our communities across the country, and their great shared experience right now is that they are suffering, they are alone, they are in peril, and we need to say to ourselves, it stops with us. We're going to help them now going forward. What do we need to do to get into the communities, strategize, and help these people, and quite frankly, help save the next generation coming after us?
Well said. I will just ask you, because we have to wrap up. You're talking about the situation from the outside looking in. And of course, an obvious question for people listening today, or know someone who's perhaps struggling today, is what you want to say to someone who is in fact struggling with a mental health issue in their life. Not the person who's saying to them, are you okay? But that actual person who's struggling with it, who doesn't really know who to talk to, what to say, where to go, what to do. What do you say to them?
Well, first of all, they're not alone. If you're listening now, you are not alone. If you've seen a marathon race where people cross the finish line and people are standing on the side of the road clapping and cheering you on, there are people out there right now doing that for you. We have a country filled with good people with kind hearts who care about each other in a very special way. You need to know that people care about you in a way you don't even know. That's the best kind of kindness is when you know that people are total strangers out there and they are supportive in the community. But beyond that, you have to share your story with people. If you are alone, especially if you're young and you don't know who to turn to, find someone in your family, find someone you trust. Might be a school teacher, might be a hockey or a baseball coach. It might be somebody who's a role model in the community. You'd be surprised. You could probably drop a pretty long list of people you could probably trust and approach. And I guarantee you won't regret it, because I guarantee you it could be the first step in a prosperous step to get you on a better path and get you out of what is now a very desperate cycle for some people, especially young people in our country.
Wow, I'm very moved, and I hope people listening are as well, having shared that story, of course, having lived that story, and now being able to help as you are in the community. Paul, thank you so much for reaching out today, and thank you so much for sharing that story.
Thank you for having me on. I'm a big fan of the show, by the way, so it's nice to be on, and I really appreciate you taking time to fit me in. Thank
you so much. Paul Hollingsworth, CTV National and news correspondent in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I was actually quite moved in hearing that story and what he went through, and imagine how many other people are, in fact, feeling that same way and going through a similar situation. So as he said, it's important to let people know. It's important to reach out. It begins with that first conversation. That's all it takes.
This has been the Montreal Now podcast with Aaron Rand.
Listen live on your radio weekday afternoons from 2 to 6
on CJAD 800
or through the iHeartRadio app.